They say money can't buy happiness, but it sure can bury secrets. What happened to the Caldwells proves that some debts are paid not in cash, but in blood. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Claire Harper first laid eyes on the old Victorian house at the edge of town. The property had been advertised as a bargain rental, a sprawling 3-bedroom home with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and enough charm to make anyone overlook its age. For Claire, who had recently moved back to her hometown after years away, it seemed like the perfect fresh start for her small family. Claire wasn't one for superstitions or ghost stories. At 32, she prided herself on being practical, level-headed, and grounded in reality. She'd spent most of her adult life working long hours as an accountant, crunching numbers and keeping track of other people's finances. But now, with her daughter Sophie starting kindergarten and her husband Mark finally landing a stable job, they were ready to settle down somewhere quiet. Somewhere safe, or so they thought. The real estate agent, a wiry man named Mr. Grayson, met them outside the house on October 12th. His suit was slightly too tight, his tie askew, and he carried a clipboard filled with papers that flapped wildly in the wind. He greeted them warmly, though there was something off about his demeanor, like he was trying too hard to seem cheerful. "This place has character," he said, gesturing toward the peeling paint and cracked windows. "Built by the Caldwell family over 100 years ago. You won't find craftsmanship like this anymore." Claire nodded politely, brushing a strand of brown hair out of her face as she surveyed the exterior. The house did have character, though perhaps more of the unsettling kind. Its steep, gabled roof loomed ominously against the gray sky, and the ivy climbing up the walls looked less like decoration and more like nature attempting to reclaim it. Even Sophie, usually chatty and full of energy, clung silently to Claire's hand as they approached the front door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and dust. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting strange shadows across the creaky wooden floors. The furniture left behind by the previous tenants, a sagging couch, a rickety dining table, added to the eerie atmosphere. Still, Claire couldn't deny the potential. With a little work, the house could be beautiful again. "It's interesting," Mark said carefully, running his fingers along the carved banister of the staircase. He glanced at Claire, eyebrows raised. "What do you think?" Claire hesitated. Something about the house gave her pause, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Maybe it was the way the floorboards groaned underfoot even when no one was walking on them. Or maybe it was the faint chill in the air despite the warmth of the day. Whatever it was, it made her skin prickle uncomfortably. But then Sophie giggled, pointing excitedly at the stained glass window above the fireplace. "Look, Mommy, it's so pretty." And just like that, Claire pushed her unease aside. They needed a home, and this one fit their budget perfectly. Practicality won out over instinct. By the end of the week, the paperwork was signed, and the Harper family officially became tenants of the Caldwell estate. Moving in felt like stepping into another era. The house was filled with odd details that hinted at its storied past. Clawfoot bathtubs, brass doorknobs engraved with intricate patterns, and a grandfather clock in the hallway that hadn't worked in decades. At first, everything seemed normal, or as normal as moving into a century-old house could be. There were the usual challenges: leaky faucets, drafty windows, and the occasional mouse scurrying across the kitchen floor. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with small things: a glass falling off the counter and shattering without explanation, doors slamming shut when no one was near them, whispers drifting down the hall late at night, too faint to understand but loud enough to wake Claire from a restless sleep. She tried to brush it off. Old houses made noise. Everyone knew that. The shifting foundation, the wind rattling the windows, it all added up to harmless creaks and groans. Yet deep down, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the living room, Claire noticed something strange. A photograph on the mantelpiece caught her eye. It was faded and yellowed with age, showing a stern-looking man in a dark suit standing beside a woman in a high-collared dress. Both stared directly into the camera, their expressions unreadable. Written on the back in spidery handwriting were 2 words, Elias Caldwell. Who's Elias Caldwell? Claire asked Mark later that night, holding up the photo. Mark shrugged, barely glancing at it. Probably the guy who built the house. Why? I don't know. Claire trailed off, studying the image again. There was something unsettling about the man's gaze. It felt like he was looking straight at her, even though the picture was over 100 years old. Just feels weird keeping someone else's stuff around. Mark chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Relax, Claire. It's just an old photo. Besides, we're renting the house, not rewriting its history. Claire forced a smile, but she didn't feel reassured. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the distant ticking of the broken grandfather clock, she couldn't stop thinking about the photograph and the name scrawled on the back. The next morning, October 19th, brought the first real warning. Signed, Claire woke up early to get a head start on cleaning the attic, which had become a dumping ground for leftover boxes and forgotten belongings. As she climbed the narrow staircase, flashlight in hand, she noticed a faint scratching sound coming from the far corner. At first she assumed it was mice, but as she moved closer, the noise grew louder, sharper, almost deliberate. Her flashlight beam landed on a dusty trunk tucked beneath a low-hanging beam. The lock was rusted, but the lid creaked open easily when she pried it apart. Inside, she found stacks of yellowed documents tied together with brittle string. Curious, she untied one bundle and unfolded the top sheet. It was a ledger, meticulously handwritten in neat columns. Dates, names, and amounts filled the pages, along with cryptic notes scribbled in the margins. Debt settled, payment overdue, unpaid balance transferred. As Claire flipped through the pages, her stomach sank. The entries dated back decades, detailing transactions between Elias Caldwell and various townspeople. Some payments were listed as complete, while others bore ominous annotations like consequences enforced or debt collected. A cold knot formed in Claire's chest. She didn't know what these records meant, but they felt wrong, like uncovering a secret that was never meant to see the light of day. Before she could read further, a sudden gust of wind slammed the attic window shut, making her jump. The flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Heart pounding, Claire scrambled to her feet and hurried downstairs. She shoved the ledger into a drawer in the kitchen, telling herself she'd deal with it later. But as she stood there, catching her breath, she realized something chilling. The scratching sound hadn't stopped. That night, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Claire debated whether to mention what she'd found. In the end, she decided against it. Mark already thought she was imagining things. Bringing up a mysterious ledger would only make him more skeptical. But as Sophie tucked into her mashed potatoes, she suddenly froze, her fork hovering midair. "Mommy," she whispered, her wide eyes fixed on the doorway. "There's someone standing there." Claire turned sharply, expecting to see Mark returning from the living room. Instead, the doorway was empty. "Sweetheart, there's no one there," Claire said gently, forcing a smile. "Finish your dinner, okay?" Sophie shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "He's still there, Mommy. He's watching us." The room went silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Claire felt a chill crawl up her spine. For the first time, she wondered if leaving might be their only option. But before she could act on that thought, the lights flickered and then went out completely. When the power came back on moments later, everything seemed normal again. Too normal. The food on their plates was untouched, the chairs still pulled out from the table. Only one thing was different. The photograph of Elias Caldwell was gone. Some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some houses hold more than just walls and memories. The next morning, October 20th, dawned gray and overcast, mirroring Claire Harper's unease. She woke up exhausted, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. The flickering lights, Sophie's terrified whispers, and the missing photograph. It felt like a bad dream, but the knot in her stomach told her otherwise. Claire tried to convince herself it was all coincidence. Old houses had quirks. They settled, groaned, and occasionally lost power. As for Sophie, well, kids had vivid, imaginations. But deep down, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Breakfast was tense. Mark sat at the table scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the weight pressing down on Claire. Sophie barely touched her cereal, her usual chatter replaced by silence. Every creak of the floorboards made Claire flinch. Every shadow seemed darker than it should be. "I think we need to call an electrician," Claire said finally, breaking the quiet. "The wiring in this place is ancient." Mark glanced up, frowning. "You're not still spooked about last night, are you? It was probably just a blown fuse." "It wasn't just the lights," Claire replied sharply, surprising even herself. She took a deep breath, softening her tone. "Something feels off. I can't explain it," Mark sighed, setting his phone aside. "Look, I get it. This house is old, and yeah, it has its quirks, but let's not jump to conclusions, okay? We'll call someone to check the wiring if it makes you feel better." Claire nodded, though she knew an electrician wouldn't fix whatever was haunting them. Still, it was a start. Later that afternoon, while Sophie napped upstairs, Claire decided to investigate further. The attic trunk and its contents weighed heavily on her mind. She retrieved the ledger from the kitchen drawer and spread it out on the dining room table, determined to make sense of it. The entries were meticulous, almost obsessive. Names appeared repeatedly alongside dates and amounts owed. Some debts were marked as settled with neat checks beside them, while others bore ominous notes like consequences enforced. Claire flipped through page after page, her hands trembling slightly as she read. One entry caught her eye, a name she recognized, Harold Grayson, dated 1953. Beside it was written, "Debt unpaid, property transferred to Caldwell Estate, Claire." Froze. Harold Grayson, the same surname as their real estate agent. Could it be a coincidence? Or was there a connection between the Caldwells and the man who'd rented them the house? Before she could dwell on it, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. Her heart leapt into her throat. Sophie. She bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping over herself. In her haste, the nursery door was ajar, and when she pushed it open, she found Sophie sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing with her dolls. "Did you hear that noise?" Claire asked, breathless. Sophie shook her head, her expression innocent. "No, Mommy, I didn't hear anything." Claire scanned the room, searching for the source of the sound. Nothing seemed out of place. No fallen objects, no open windows. Yet the air felt heavier here, colder somehow. She shivered despite herself. "Stay here," she told Sophie firmly. "I'll be right back." Returning to the hallway, Claire noticed something strange. The grandfather clock in the foyer was ticking again. It hadn't worked since they moved in. She approached it cautiously, her pulse quickening. The pendulum swung steadily, casting eerie shadows across the wall. And then she saw it. A faint outline etched into the glass face of the clock. At first glance it looked like scratches, but upon closer inspection, she realized they formed words pay what is owed. Her blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, knocking over a side table. The crash startled her, and she turned to flee, but stopped short when she saw the figure standing at the top of the staircase. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a dark suit that seemed impossibly old-fashioned. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and unblinking. He stared directly at her, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Claire screamed, clutching the banister for support. When she blinked, the figure was gone. That evening, Mark returned home from work to find Claire pacing the living room, visibly shaken. She recounted everything, the message on the clock, the mysterious man on the stairs, and watched as doubt clouded his features. "You're sure you weren't imagining it?" he asked gently, though skepticism tinged his voice. "I know what I saw," Claire snapped, frustration bubbling over. "This isn't in my head, Mark. Something's happening here, and I don't think we're safe." Mark hesitated, torn between dismissing her fears and acknowledging the possibility that something was truly wrong. Finally, he sighed. "Okay, let's look into it. Maybe there's a logical explanation." Together, they decided to visit the local library the following day to research the Caldwell family. If anyone could shed light on the house's history, it would be the town archives. On October 21st, Claire and Mark spent hours poring over dusty books and microfiche records. They learned that Elias Caldwell had been a wealthy businessman in the late 1800s, known for his ruthless business practices and questionable morals. He'd acquired much of his fortune through loans and property deals, often using intimidation and threats to ensure repayment. But one detail stood out among the rest. Elias Caldwell had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1902. His body was never found, and rumors swirled about foul play, or worse. Some claimed he'd made deals with forces beyond comprehension, trading souls for wealth and power. Others whispered of curses placed on those who crossed him. As they dug deeper, Claire discovered another chilling fact. Several families who had lived in the Caldwell house over the decades had met tragic ends. Fires, accidents, unexplained illnesses, all linked to the property. Each tenant had reportedly experienced strange occurrences before disaster struck. "This isn't just bad luck," Claire murmured, staring at the list of names. "It's a pattern." Mark rubbed his temples, looking increasingly uneasy. "So what do we do? Move out?" "We might not have a choice," Claire admitted. "But where does it end? If this house is cursed or haunted, we can't just walk away without understanding why." That night, as they prepared for bed, the tension in the house was palpable. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Even Sophie seemed restless, tossing and turning in her sleep. Around midnight, Claire awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. She reached for Mark, but he was already awake, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded grimly. Together they crept out of bed and followed the noise to the attic. The door was slightly ajar, though neither of them remembered leaving it open. Inside, the trunk lay overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. Papers fluttered in the breeze from the broken window, and the faint scent of earth and decay filled the air. In the center of the chaos stood the photograph of Elias Caldwell, propped upright against the wall. But this time, it wasn't alone. Beside it was a new image, a Polaroid snapshot of their family, taken during a picnic last summer. Written across the bottom in jagged handwriting were the words, "You will pay." Claire gasped, clutching Mark's arm. Before either of them could react, the attic door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. And then came the laughter, low, guttural, and utterly devoid of humanity. When the past comes calling, it doesn't ask politely. It demands. By the time Claire and Mark stumbled out of the attic, their hearts racing, dawn was breaking over the horizon. The laughter had faded into silence, but the threat lingered, in the air like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. They didn't speak as they hurried downstairs, clutching each other for reassurance. Whatever entity, or force, had been in that attic wasn't done with them yet. October 22nd marked the beginning of a new level of terror. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the house echoed louder than before. Every shadow seemed darker. Sophie, sensing her parents' fear, clung to Claire more tightly than ever. Her once bright eyes now held a haunted look, as if she too could feel the weight pressing down on the family. Claire knew they couldn't stay in the house much longer, not without answers. But leaving felt like running away from something far bigger than themselves. She needed to understand what they were dealing with, even if it meant confronting forces beyond comprehension. That morning, Claire decided to visit Harold Grayson, the real estate agent who'd rented them the house. Something about his demeanor during their initial meeting still bothered her, a nervousness that hadn't made sense at the time. Now, after discovering the ledger entry tied to his surname, she suspected he might know more than he'd let on. She drove to his office, a small brick building tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. The sign outside read Grayson Realty, its letters slightly faded. Inside, the space was cramped and cluttered, with stacks of files piled haphazardly on desks and shelves. Harold himself looked surprised to see her. "Mrs. Harper," he said, rising awkwardly from his chair. "What brings you here?" "I need to talk to you about the house," Claire said bluntly, taking a seat across from him. "There are things happening there, things I think you should have warned us about." Harold shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. Things? Like what? Like strange noises, objects moving on their own, and messages appearing where they shouldn't. Claire leaned forward, her voice low but firm. And then there's this. She pulled out a photocopy of the ledger entry mentioning Harold Grayson's name. Care to explain? His face paled as he stared at the document. For a moment he said nothing, his hands trembling slightly. Finally he sighed, rubbing his temples. I was hoping no one would find out, he muttered. It's not my secret to tell, Mrs. Harper, but since you're living there now. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Elias Caldwell wasn't just a businessman. He was cruel. People owed him money, and when they couldn't pay, he took other forms of payment. Land, possessions, and sometimes worse. What do you mean, worse? Claire pressed. Harold glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. Stories say he dabbled in dark practices, made deals with entities. When tenants couldn't repay their debts, bad things happened. To them, to their families, accidents, illnesses, disappearances. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Why didn't you tell us any of this before we signed the lease? Because I thought it was all superstition, Harold exclaimed, throwing up his hands. Folklore passed down through generations. I never believed it until recently. Other renters, they've reported similar things. Strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena. And then they leave, swearing never to come back. So why keep renting the place out? Claire demanded, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Because I have no choice, Harold snapped, his composure cracking. The Caldwell estate owns me, Mrs. Harper, literally. My grandfather defaulted on a loan decades ago and the debt got passed down to me. If I stop managing the property, who knows what'll happen? I'm trapped. Same as you. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Claire sat back, processing everything he'd said. This wasn't just about an old house or a greedy landlord. It was a curse, a legacy of greed and unpaid debts stretching back over a century. That evening, Claire shared what she'd learned. With Mark, they sat together in the living room, the atmosphere heavy with dread. Sophie played quietly on the floor, seemingly oblivious to their conversation. We can't stay here, Mark said finally, his voice tight with frustration. This isn't normal, Claire. It's dangerous. I know, Claire replied softly. But leaving won't solve anything. We don't know what we're dealing with, or how far it will follow us. Mark opened his mouth to argue but stopped short when the lights flickered violently. Both turned toward the hallway, where the grandfather clock began ticking again, louder and faster than before. Then came the footsteps. They weren't coming from upstairs this time. They were directly beneath them, in the basement. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth. Claire grabbed a flashlight and motioned for Mark to follow her. Together they descended the narrow staircase leading to the basement, Sophie trailing behind. Despite Claire's protests, the air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth filled their nostrils. At the bottom, the beam of the flashlight revealed a door embedded in the far wall, a door neither of them remembered seeing before. It was old, its surface, warped and splintered, with rusted hinges that groaned under the weight of years. What is that? Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know, Claire admitted, her pulse hammering in her ears, but we need to find out. With shaking hands, she reached for the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a hidden room bathed in shadows. At first glance, it appeared empty, but then the flashlight caught something in the corner. Collection of items lay scattered across the floor. Photographs, jewelry, trinkets, all belonging to former tenants of the house. Among them was a framed picture of Sophie, smiling brightly in her kindergarten uniform. Beside it sat a porcelain doll Claire recognized from Sophie's toy box. No, Claire breathed, stepping backward in horror. How did they get here? Before anyone could answer, the temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the walls, and the faint sound of laughter echoed through the room. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. In its place stood Elias Caldwell, He materialized slowly, his form wavering like smoke, coalescing into shape. His suit was immaculate, his face pale and expressionless. But his eyes, burned with an intensity that froze Claire to the core. "You have trespassed," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You owe a debt." "We don't owe you anything," Claire shouted, her fear giving way to anger. "Whatever you did to those people, it ends now." Elias tilted his head, studying her as if amused by her defiance. "Debts are inherited." "Mrs. Harper, your family took possession of my home. Therefore, you inherit the obligations of those who came before you." Mark stepped forward, shielding Claire and Sophie. "Leave us alone. We're not part of your twisted games." For a moment, Elias remained silent, his gaze shifting between them. Then, with a chilling smile, he vanished, leaving only the whisper of his final words. "You will pay." Back upstairs, the family huddled together, shaken to their core. Whatever hope they'd had of escaping unscathed was gone. Elias Caldwell wasn't just a ghost. He was a predator, stalking them with patience born of centuries. As the night wore on, Claire made a decision. If they couldn't run from this, they would fight it. But first, she needed help. She picked up the phone and dialed the number of a local historian she'd met at the library, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Carter who specialized in folklore and paranormal phenomena. When Evelyn answered, Claire didn't mince words. "We need your help. Something's inside our house, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then softly, Evelyn replied, "Tell me everything. Some fights can't be won with strength alone. Sometimes the only weapon you have is the truth." By the time Dr. Evelyn Carter arrived at the Caldwell house on October 23rd, the Harper family was teetering on the edge of collapse. Sleep deprivation had taken its toll. Dark circles shadowed Claire's eyes, and Mark's hands trembled as he paced the living room. Even Sophie, usually so full of energy, sat silently on the couch, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. Evelyn stepped inside cautiously, her sharp gaze sweeping over the room. She was in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. A leather satchel hung from her shoulder, filled with books, notes, and tools Claire couldn't identify. "This place feels heavy," Evelyn remarked, setting her bag down on the coffee table. "Like there's something lingering here watching us." Claire nodded grimly. "You don't know half of it." Over the next hour, she recounted everything that had happened. The strange occurrences, Elias Caldwell's appearance, and the hidden room in the basement. Evelyn listened intently, jotting down notes and occasionally nodding as if piecing together a puzzle. When Claire finished, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. "What you're dealing with isn't just a haunting, it's a curse. One rooted in greed, betrayal, and blood. Elias Caldwell didn't just collect debts, he bound them to this house. Every tenant who lived here inherited those obligations, whether they knew it or not." "So how do we break it?" Mark asked, his voice strained with desperation. "That's the tricky part," Evelyn admitted. "Curses like this aren't easily undone. They require confronting the source directly and paying the debt in full." "What does that even mean?" Claire demanded, her frustration bubbling over. "We don't owe him anything." "Maybe, not consciously," Evelyn replied gently. "But curses work differently. They twist reality, forcing victims to settle accounts they may not understand. In this case, Elias likely sees your presence in his house as grounds for repayment." "And what happens if we refuse?" Mark pressed. Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Refusal comes at a cost. The curse will escalate until it claims its due, whether through harm, tragedy, or worse." The room fell silent, the weight of Evelyn's words sinking in. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sophie broke the quiet with a soft whisper. "He wants my doll." All eyes turned to her. She clutched the porcelain doll tightly, her knuckles white. "He said I have to give it back." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Earlier, when they'd discovered the hidden room, the doll had been among the items collected there, items belonging to former tenants. But Sophie had owned it since she was a baby. How could Elias claim it belonged to him? Evelyn knelt beside Sophie, her tone gentle but probing. "Do you remember seeing him, sweetheart? The man who told you this?" Sophie nodded, her lower lip trembling. "He came into my room last night. He said bad things would happen if I didn't give it to him." Claire's heart clenched. She reached for her daughter, pulling her close. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now." But Evelyn's brow furrowed, deep in thought. "This changes things. If the doll is tied to the curse, it might be a key to breaking it, or fulfilling it." That evening, armed with Evelyn's guidance, the Harpers prepared for a confrontation. They gathered in the living room, surrounded by protective symbols Evelyn had drawn on the floor using salt and chalk. Candles flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We need to draw him out," Evelyn explained, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Use the doll as bait. When he appears, we'll negotiate, or fight, if necessary." "Negotiate?" Mark echoed incredulously. "With a ghost? Not all spirits are beyond reason," Evelyn countered. "If we appeal to his sense of justice, we might find a way to end this without further bloodshed." Claire wasn't convinced, but she didn't see another option. Taking a deep breath, she placed the doll in the center of the circle, her hands shaking slightly. "Let's get this over with." The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly. The house seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Then, without warning, the temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the windows, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Elias appeared suddenly, materializing in the doorway. His presence was overwhelming, radiating power and malice. His hollow eyes locked onto the doll, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "You brought it," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Good. Now the debt is settled." "No," Claire shouted, stepping forward protectively. "You can't take her things, or her life. We're not part of your twisted game." Elias's expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. "You misunderstand. The debt is not yours to question. It must be paid." Before anyone could react, the candles snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged as the ground began to shake violently, throwing everyone off balance. Sophie screamed, clutching Claire desperately. In the chaos, Evelyn shouted instructions. "Stay within the circle. Don't let him cross the boundary." But Elias wasn't interested in crossing lines. With a wave of his hand, the doll levitated into the air, hovering inches from his grasp. Claire lunged for it instinctively, but an invisible force slammed her backward, knocking the wind out of her. "Stop!" Evelyn commanded, brandishing a small vial of liquid. "By the laws of binding and exchange, I command you to halt!" To everyone's astonishment, Elias froze mid-motion, his form flickering like a faulty light bulb. Evelyn seized the opportunity, chanting rapidly in a language none of them recognized. The air crackled with energy, and the symbols on the floor glowed faintly. For a moment, it seemed to work. Elias wavered, his grip on the doll loosening. But then, with a roar of fury, he shattered the barrier, sending shards of glowing salt flying in all directions. The circle collapsed, and the room plunged into chaos once more. "Run!" Evelyn yelled, grabbing Sophie's hand. "Get out of here!" Claire and Mark scrambled to their feet, ushering Sophie toward the front door. Behind them, Elias's laughter echoed through the house, growing louder and more menacing with each step. They burst outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath. Evelyn stood nearby, clutching the doll tightly. Her face was pale but resolute. "It's not over," she said grimly. "He's stronger than I anticipated. Breaking the curse will take more than I can offer." "Then what do we do?" Claire demanded, tears streaming down her face. "How do we stop him?" Evelyn hesitated, her gaze distant. "There's one last option, but it's dangerous. To truly end this, we'll need to confront Elias on his own terms. In the place where the curse began." "The attic," Claire realized, her stomach sinking. "That's where we found the ledger." Evelyn nodded. Exactly. But beware. The price of breaking the curse may be higher than any of us are willing to pay. As they stood there, battered and terrified, the house loomed behind them like a predator waiting to strike. Inside, Elias Caldwell bided his time, knowing they would return, because the game wasn't over yet. Some debts are paid in blood, and some battles leave scars that never heal. October 24th dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with storm clouds that mirrored the weight pressing down on the Harper family. After fleeing the house the previous night, they had taken refuge at a nearby motel, a sterile room with beige walls and scratchy blankets that offered little comfort. Sophie slept fitfully, clutching her stuffed rabbit while Claire sat by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked parking lot. Evelyn Carter was already hard at work preparing for their final confrontation. She spent hours poring over ancient texts and consulting obscure rituals, her determination unwavering despite the grim reality of what lay ahead. By midday, she had assembled everything they would need: candles, herbs, talismans, and a small silver dagger engraved with symbols Claire didn't recognize. "It's not just about breaking the curse," Evelyn explained as they gathered around the motel table. "It's about severing Elias Caldwell's connection to this world. But to do that, we'll have to face him directly and make him pay for his crimes." Claire swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the items Evelyn had laid out, a bundle of dried sage tied with red string. "What happens if we fail?" Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Failure means he wins. The curse will consume you, all of you. And whoever inherits this house next will inherit your debt." Mark clenched his fists, frustration boiling beneath the surface. "So what's the plan? We march into his lair and hope for the best?" "Not exactly," Evelyn replied calmly. "We go prepared. Tonight, under the cover of darkness, we'll return to the attic. That's where the curse began, and that's where it must end. Using these tools," she gestured to the array of objects spread across the table, "we'll perform a ritual to bind Elias and force him to release his hold on the house." "And if he fights back?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He will," Evelyn admitted. "But we can't let fear stop us. This is our only chance." By nightfall, the group stood once again on the threshold of the Caldwell house. The mansion loomed before them like a specter, its windows dark and uninviting. Rain pattered against the roof, creating an eerie soundtrack to their mission. "This feels like walking into a trap," Mark muttered, his breath visible in the chilly air. "It is a trap," Evelyn said bluntly, "but we're bringing bait." She held up the doll, now wrapped in protective charms. "He won't be able to resist." With reluctant steps, they entered the house. The atmosphere inside was suffocating, the air thick with the scent of damp, wood, and decay. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering beams of their flashlights. Every creak of the floorboards echoed louder than it should, each sound amplifying their unease. They made their way upstairs, avoiding the basement entirely. The attic door yawned open at the top of the narrow staircase, beckoning them forward. Inside, the space was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustle of papers stirred by drafts slipping through cracks in the walls. Evelyn directed them to form a circle in the center of the room, placing candles at each cardinal point. She handed everyone a lit taper and instructed them to focus on keeping the flames steady. "If the lights go out," she warned, "we lose our protection." As they worked, Claire noticed something odd about the trunk they'd discovered earlier. Its lid was slightly ajar, revealing a glint of metal within. Against Evelyn's advice to stay focused, she approached cautiously and peered inside. What she found made her stomach churn. A collection of old keys, tarnished with age but unmistakably significant. One of them bore the initials EC etched into its surface. Before she could examine it further, a low growl rumbled through the attic. The temperature plummeted, and the candles sputtered wildly. Elias Caldwell appeared suddenly, his form more solid and menacing than ever before. "You dare return," he snarled, his voice reverberating through the rafters. You dare challenge me in my own domain." Evelyn stepped forward, holding the doll aloft. "Elias Caldwell, by the laws of binding and justice, I summon you to answer for your crimes. Your reign of greed and cruelty ends tonight." For a moment, Elias seemed taken aback, his confidence wavering. Then his expression twisted into a sneer. "You think your trinkets and chants can stop me? I am beyond such trivialities." "We'll see about that," Evelyn shot back, beginning the ritual. Her voice rose steadily as she recited incantations in a language Claire couldn't understand. The candles flared brighter, casting sharp shadows across the room. Elias roared in fury, lashing out with unseen forces. Books flew off shelves, furniture toppled over, and the very walls seemed to groan under the strain. Sophie screamed, clutching Claire tightly, while Mark shielded them both with his body. Through the chaos, Evelyn remained steadfast, her voice cutting through the din like a blade. "By fire and ash, by earth and bone, I bind thee, Elias Caldwell, to face thy reckoning." A blinding light erupted from the center of the circle, engulfing the room. Elias staggered backward, his form flickering erratically. For the first time, fear flashed across his face. "No!" he bellowed, reaching desperately for the doll. "You cannot undo what has been done." But Evelyn wasn't finished. She grabbed the silver dagger and plunged it into the wooden floorboards, driving it deep into the heart of the circle. "I seal thee, spirit of malice, until judgment claims thee." The house shuddered violently, as if protesting the intrusion. The attic filled with a deafening roar, drowning out all other sounds. Then, with a final ear-splitting scream, Elias vanished. Silence fell abruptly, broken only by the sound of rain tapping against the roof. The candles burned steadily once more, their flames calm and unwavering. "It's over," Evelyn whispered, collapsing onto her knees. "He's gone." In the aftermath, the Harpers emerged from the house shaken but alive. The oppressive weight that had plagued them for weeks lifted almost immediately, replaced by an eerie stillness. They packed their belongings quickly, eager to leave the cursed property behind. As they drove away, Claire glanced back at the house one last time. Though battered and worn, it no longer felt malevolent, just empty. "What happens now?" Mark asked quietly, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We move on," Claire replied, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "And we never look back." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that some scars ran deeper than anyone realized. In the trunk they'd left behind, the key bearing Elias Caldwell's initials gleamed faintly in the moonlight, waiting for someone else to find it. Some endings are only beginnings in disguise. October 25th marked the start of a new chapter for the Harper family, though none of them felt truly free. They moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a modest space far removed from the grandeur and terror of the Caldwell house. The change was welcome, but the memories lingered like shadows clinging to the edges of their minds. Claire tried to focus on rebuilding normalcy. She enrolled Sophie in a new school, cleaned the apartment obsessively, and forced herself to cook meals that no one seemed to enjoy. Mark threw himself into work, staying late at the office to avoid confronting the questions they both refused to ask aloud. Had they truly defeated Elias Caldwell, or had they simply delayed the inevitable? Despite their efforts to move forward, reminders of the past crept in unbidden. Sophie often woke screaming from nightmares, her cries echoing through the thin walls of their temporary home. Claire found herself checking locks multiple times each night, jumping at every creak or groan of the building's aging structure. Even Mark, usually stoic and unflappable, started sleeping with a baseball bat beside his bed. Evelyn Carter visited them once more before returning to her own life. She brought news that did little to ease their anxiety. "The curse is broken, for now," she said cautiously, sitting across from them at their tiny kitchen table. "But curses like that don't vanish completely. They leave traces, echoes, of their power. Someone else could awaken it if they're not careful." "What does that mean?" Claire asked, her voice tight with frustration. "How do we know it won't come back?" "It means you need to stay vigilant," Evelyn replied, gently. And it means this story doesn't end with you. The Caldwell legacy will find its way into someone else's hands eventually. Her words hung heavy in the air long after she left. Weeks passed, then months. Life began to settle into a fragile routine. Sophie adjusted to her new school, making friends and rediscovering her laughter. Mark landed a promotion, which eased some of the financial strain they'd been under since moving. Claire even started volunteering at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others. But beneath the surface, cracks remained. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. Every news report about strange occurrences in their old neighborhood sent her spiraling back to those dark nights in the Caldwell house. She avoided driving past the property altogether, fearing what she might see or feel if she got too close. Then, one evening in early December, something happened that shattered their fragile peace. Mark came home late from work, carrying a stack of mail he'd picked up from the post office box. Among the bills and advertisements was an envelope addressed to Claire in spidery handwriting. Her name was scrawled across the front in ink so faded it looked decades old. "What is this?" Mark asked, handing it to her. Claire stared at it, her heart pounding. The paper felt brittle, as if it had been sitting in a drawer for years. She opened it slowly, dreading what she might find inside. The letter contained only 3 sentences, written in the same jagged script. "You may have escaped my grasp, but the debt remains unpaid. Others will take your place, and the cycle will continue. Remember me?" Claire dropped the letter as if burned, her hands shaking violently. Mark snatched it up, reading the message with a growing alarm. "This isn't possible," he muttered, turning the envelope over in search of clues. "Who sent this? How did they know where to find us?" "I don't think it's from a person," Claire whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It's from him." That night, neither of them slept. They sat together in the dim glow of the living room lamp, debating what to do next. Returning to the Caldwell house wasn't an option. It was too dangerous, too tainted by evil. But ignoring the warning felt equally reckless. "We can't just sit here and wait for something to happen," Mark said finally, running a hand through his hair. "We need answers." The next morning, they decided to visit the town archives. Again, hoping to uncover more information about Elias Caldwell's history. What they found chilled them to the bone. Buried deep within the records was a document detailing a series of disappearances linked to the Caldwell estate, all tenants who had lived there after Elias's death. Each case bore eerie similarities: reports of strange noises, objects moving on their own, and families vanishing without explanation. Most disturbing of all was a handwritten note attached to the file, dated 1923. "The debts of Elias Caldwell cannot be erased. His spirit ensures repayment one way or another." Claire sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what they'd uncovered. "This isn't just about us," she murmured. "It's about everyone who comes after us." Mark nodded grimly. "If we don't stop this, it'll keep happening. Someone else will pay the price." Armed with their findings, they reached out to Evelyn Carter once more. Together, they devised a plan to ensure the Caldwell house would never claim another victim. With the help of local authorities, they petitioned to have the property condemned, citing structural instability and hazardous conditions. It took weeks of relentless effort, but eventually the request was approved. On January 15th, demolition crews arrived at the site. Bulldozers tore through the rotting wood and crumbling brick, reducing the mansion to rubble. As the walls fell, Claire stood nearby, watching silently. She felt no satisfaction, only a hollow ache, knowing the battle wasn't truly over. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn joined them at their apartment. She carried a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate patterns. "For protection," she explained, placing it on the coffee table. "These talismans will shield you from any lingering energy tied to the house. Keep them close." Claire thanked her, though doubt lingered in her mind. No charm could erase the scars left behind, not the sleepless nights, not the fear that still clung to her like a second skin. Months turned into years. The Harpers rebuilt their lives piece by piece. Learning to live with the knowledge that some wounds never fully heal, Sophie grew into a bright, curious teenager, unaware of the full extent of what her family had endured. Mark and Claire rarely spoke of the Caldwell house, choosing instead to focus on the future, but every now and then, when the wind howled just right or the shadows stretched too long, Claire would hear it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. "Remember me." And she knew, deep down, that the legacy of Elias Caldwell hadn't ended. It had merely shifted, waiting for its next chapter to unfold. The end.